Some battles are decided by who's left standing at the end of the day. But others, well, their story is really defined by what happens long after the fighting stops. Today, we're diving into one of history's most fascinating and debated clashes, the Battle of Haldighati.
It seems like such a simple question, right? But believe me, for over 400 years, the answer has been anything but clear. So let's get into it and unpack one of the most iconic confrontations in Indian history.
So, picture this. On one side, you've got Maharana Pratap of Mewar. He's the leader of the legendary Sisodia clan of Rajputs, a line of warriors who had ruled for centuries. And on the other side, the colossal Mughal Empire, led by Emperor Akbar, stretching across almost the entire subcontinent. I mean, it's a classic David versus Goliath story.
Okay, to really understand this battle, we first have to get a handle on the stakes. This wasn't just some random skirmish. It was the final showdown of a huge strategic goal.
By the 1570s, Akbar had pretty methodically brought almost all the major Rajput states into his empire. They'd accepted his authority. But Mewar, which was seen as the leading state in the region, absolutely refused to bend the knee. They were pretty much the last major holdout.
So what did Akbar want? He wanted Mewar to become what's called a vassal state, basically to accept him as their overlord. But this wasn't just about pride or conquest. It was pure strategy. You see, Mewar's hilly territory was a critical land route to the super-wealthy ports of Gujarat, and Akbar needed to lock down his trade routes. But here's the thing about Akbar. He was a really shrewd diplomat. Before jumping straight to war, he tried to get what he wanted peacefully. He sent a whole series of messengers to try and bring Pratap to the negotiating table. And he didn't just try once. He sent 4 separate diplomatic missions to try and convince Pratap. He even sent fellow Rajputs like Man Singh, probably thinking, hey, maybe a kinsman can get through to him. But every single time, the answer was a hard no. Pratap was just not going to compromise his kingdom's independence. And this quote, wow, it just perfectly illustrates where Pratap's head was at. It's attributed to him, and it frames this whole conflict not just in political terms, but in cultural and religious ones. He saw the Mughals as foreign rulers, Turks as he called them, and he swore he would never, ever accept their authority. So after 4 failed attempts at peace, you can see where this is going. The talking was done. The only thing left on the table was war. And that war finally came to a head on a blazing hot day in June, in a narrow mountain pass called Haldighati, a name that literally means the turmeric-colored valley because of its yellow soil. Now, this is where history gets a little fuzzy. Just look at the difference in the reported army sizes here. Mewari tradition talks about these epic numbers, 20,000 against 80,000. But then you have eyewitnesses like the historian al-Badayuni, who was actually in the battle, and he gives much smaller, more realistic figures. It just goes to show you how history can be a mix of fact and legend. But what everyone agrees on is this: the Mughals definitely had the numbers on their side.
This diagram here gives us a kind of bird's eye view of how they lined up. Pratap, who was commanding from the center, was smart. He used the narrow pass to try and cancel out the Mughals' numerical advantage. The Mughal army, led by another Rajput general, Man Singh, set up with a vanguard, strong flanks, and a reserve force. The battle itself was absolute chaos, but it really boils down to 4 critical turning points. First, Mewar's initial charge was just devastating. They smashed the Mughal vanguard, their flanks crumbled, and they started to retreat. For a second, it looked like this impossible victory was actually going to happen. But then came a really clever trick. A Mughal officer started beating his drums and shouting that Emperor Akbar himself was arriving with reinforcements. Now, it wasn't true, but it worked perfectly. The Mughal morale soared, and the exhausted Mewari soldiers were crushed. In the chaos that followed, Pratap was wounded, and seeing this, one of his chieftains, a guy named Man Singh, made the ultimate sacrifice. He put on Pratap's royal symbols, fooling the Mughals into thinking he was the Rana. This incredible act of heroism drew the enemy attack and gave Pratap the precious time he needed to get away.
And if you want to get a sense of just how brutal and complicated this fight was, listen to this. With Rajput warriors on both sides, things got confusing. The Mughal commander, Asif Khan, was asked how to tell friend from foe. His response was just chillingly pragmatic. It really reveals a cold calculus that went way beyond simple loyalties. So, the fighting's over, Pratap is on the run, and the Mughals hold the field. That's a clear victory, right? Well, this is where the story gets really interesting. Let's break it down. For the Mughals, sure, it was a tactical win. They controlled the battlefield. But they totally failed in their main mission, which was to capture or kill Pratap and end the resistance for good. And for Mewar, yeah, it was a brutal defeat on the field, but because they saved their leader, the fight for independence was far from over. In fact, think about it. The entire point of this massive campaign was to get Pratap. So how many times was he ever captured or forced to formally surrender? The number on your screen says it all. A big, fat 0. The primary objective was never achieved. And for this failure, Man Singh was actually banished from Akbar's court for a while.
Because the true story of Haldighati, its real meaning, isn't found in those few hours of fighting. It's found in the years and decades that followed. So let's take a look at the battle's long shadow.
See, for Pratap, this defeat wasn't the end, not by a long shot. It was actually the start of a whole new and very effective phase of his resistance. He launched this relentless guerrilla war from the hills, constantly picking off Mughal outposts and supply lines. Eventually, Mughal attention shifted to other parts of the empire, and as it did, Pratap started retaking his land. By the time he died, he had reclaimed almost his entire kingdom.
And this brings us right up to today, where the legacy of this battle is still fiercely debated. For many people, Pratap is a national hero, a powerful symbol of defiance against a massive empire. But others argue that this view is a more modern take, one that simplifies a very complex political fight. They'll point out that painting it as a simple Hindu-Muslim conflict isn't really accurate, especially when you remember that both armies were diverse. Pratap had Muslims in his army, and Akbar's army was led by a Rajput.
You know, maybe Pratap himself gave us the best way to look at his struggle. He's said to have believed that things like land and wealth are temporary. They come and go. But a great name, a legacy of standing up for what you believe in, that's what truly lasts forever. Which leaves us with one final thought. The Mughals won the day at Haldighati, but you could argue Pratap won the war for his legacy. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is a battle story decided on the field, or is it forged in the memories and the stories that are told for